Welcome to Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures and e-zine of the Futures Forum live online. We exchange ideas, information, and inspiration about the futures we want. Get Future Sense Now with host Dr. Claire Nelson, futurist and editor of Human Futures.
Greetings and salutations and welcome to Future Sense Now, an online e-magazine of the Futures Forum. We are celebrating Black History Month and once again having a conversation on the future history of Black America. What will we be doing in the year 2030 and beyond? Why 2030? Well, the United States of America by 2030, it is said, will become a majority minority country and will no longer be the world's sole superpower. Now we have gone through a brutal election 2 years ago. The last 24 months almost have been about the COVID transition, and we are 2 presidential cycles away from this big year, 2030, which is also a global pull year. The UN agenda has set out 17 global goals for achieving global sustainability. Goal number 10 focuses on inequality. So are we in America focusing around how we might use this global agenda to address the challenges for Blacks in America? How might the economic, social, and technological shifts emerging impact the well-being of the Black community? And in this episode, I will be speaking with Dr. Tanisha Taylor, who is department chair and associate professor of communication in the Communication Studies Department at Texas Southern University. Her research melds the boundaries of womanist rhetoric, intercultural communication, gender communication, digital humanities, and Afrofuturism studies. And so her recent publications include Word Making or Word Breaking, a Black womanist perspective on social media crisis in higher education. And so she's also, more importantly, working with setting up a Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies and increasing basically equitable inclusion of Black and Brown people in medical trials. A lot of things happening there. And certainly somebody who is very active, as you heard, in trying to explore what it means to think about the future for Black America. Welcome, Dr. Tanisha Taylor. How are you?
Thank you. I'm great. How are you?
Fine, thank you. So let's talk about the future you want or you see. 2030, the picture is 8 billion people, right? AI everywhere. They're thinking 400 billion mobile phones. Questions about unemployment, unionism, but basically the deepening technological transformation everywhere. Now, we don't know how that has necessarily shifted since COVID for the better or for the worse, but this is the question around inequality and how it might emerge. So let's start off with this first question from your vantage point, based on what you're working on and what you're seeing. When you think about 2030 and inequality, what at first glance do you think the Black community ought to be doing to move the needle of disparity in the correct direction?
One of the things I think that we should probably be thinking about in the Black community is sort of what we want to see our future to look like, right? And understand that that future is a future that's coming with technology. We're not going to get a future that doesn't include technology, right? We're not going to have a future that doesn't include cryptocurrencies and include digital arts and different things, right? But we need to start actually just having a conversation about the fact that and a recognition that we're going to be here in the future, right? We're not going to not be here. We've been here in every version of the future of the past, and we're going to keep being here in every version of the future in the future. And so for me, it's one that says, you know, we're not going to keep pushing into building spaces for other people, but we're really going to build space for ourselves. And so that means building and protecting our institutions, building and protecting our own spaces. Now that doesn't mean that we don't, you know, have spaces of integration and sort of collaborative space with other folks, but it means that we say, okay, these are the pockets that are ours, right? And these are the things that we're going to do to kind of sustain and protect ourselves. I think one of my favorite things that I've seen through the pandemic in that sort of regard is the way that Black women in particular have said, you know, I'm going to protect the space of my own mind, right? By, you know, decentralizing things that aren't of value to me or don't value me, by moving to the side those things that are not healthy for me and my family, and really start to think about how we're going to shape the world around us in a way that just centers us, right? That says that I am important. I think that's
I want to say that before you go on, because you said something I really want to pause, because you said we've always been here in the past futures and there are different versions of the futures. I want you to unpack that, because a lot of people don't think about the fact that the landscape is a space in which the future is continually being emerging. And perhaps with your skill as a communicator, you might do a very good job of that, especially when you consider that, yes, there are many futures emerging, but we also are living in a shared future, not just shared with Black community, but shared with everybody else. So could you kind of juxtapose what that means?
So I have this idea of the future past, the past future, the future present, the present past, right? These are all things that kind of I've pulled on out of Black speculative art, out of future studies, out of even out of womanist rhetoric, right? This idea that we build and we speak into the present, this idea of the future past and the idea of the past future. And so what I mean by that is think of it as sort of, we tend to talk about, especially Black cultures, African cultures, as having an understanding of time that is cyclical, right? So there's not a beginning or an end. It's a cycle, it's a circle, and it kind of feeds into each other, right? So building on that idea, the idea of the past future and the future past is that you're always already in the past and you're always already in the future, right? Whether you know it or not, whether you accept it or not, whether you talk about it or not. And so borrowing a little bit from Asante's Afrocentric idea and from the idea of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which for Sapir-Whorf hypothesis argues that a culture can only understand the things it has words for. And Asante's Afrocentric idea with the idea of Nemo is that you speak into existence those things that you can talk about, right? And so for Black
in the beginning was the word. In the beginning was the word. It's a very spiritual construct. Breath, word, and formation of things.
Exactly. And so the idea of the future past is that you can speak from the past into the future, right? And you speak the future into existence. And if you don't have the words, the capacity, the power to be able to do that, then you're not going to be able to create a future past or a future present,
Yeah.
And so for me, though, I argue that Black folks have always done that, right?
Yeah.
Even if we didn't realize we were doing that, we've always done that, especially in an American context, right? If you think about sort of the power of the slave narrative, I studied as part of my graduate thesis, right? Black women's use of the slave narrative and the pulpit, right? Those narratives are all about speaking into the future past, what these women wanted to see in terms of freedom and what freedom was going to look like, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's no way they could have gotten there if they didn't talk about it, right?
Yeah.
And even encoding what that looks like through quilting, through narrative, through song, right? There are all these ways that we sort of coded our way into the future, right?
Yes.
And imagined ourselves as existent in the future in particular kinds of ways. And
Yeah.
so for me, it's about us, understanding that this is a thing we've always done, right?
Okay.
And that's the thing that we need to continue to do is speak ourselves into our collective and individual future and speak that into existence in ways that might mean that we're doing that in ways that actually are radically different from the ways that we've done them in the past, right? And that doesn't mean that we leave those past things behind. We do bring them with us into a future past. And we stand on those things as we build into the future, right?
So you're talking about Black women in particular as a womanist scholar, and I wanted to probably ask about how do you think the rising, let's say, tide of Black women in public office. We have a Black female vice president. We have record numbers of women running for elected office at all levels of government across the country. And we now have a very contentious conversation happening around whether there should and has to be a Black Supreme Court judge. In your consideration about this future that we co-create, do you see that political leadership is a necessary and sufficient condition to advancing whatever we might consider the Black agenda? And I'm going to just maybe encapsulate the Black agenda for me as reducing the inequality gap. If there's nothing else, because at least we have nothing that we agree on. So let us agree that maybe it's that, right? So do you see that that is a necessary condition?
I do. I think that you can only build a table if you know where to find the resources, right? So for such a long time, we've said, oh, pull a chair up to the table, and if they don't have a chair for you, bring your own, right? If they don't have food for you, make your own, right? And for me, at this point in our sort of global history, it's now about, I don't want to bring my own food. I don't want to bring my own chair. I want to build my own table because I don't even like what your table looks like. It's not cute. Right? And so for me, I'm starting to look around and say, none of that has served us as much as we have wanted. Right. Yeah. And maybe the idea of inclusion and equity at this point isn't that we get a spot at the table, is rather that we get to build our own.
Yeah.
Right. And really imagine that really this table is in a room, right? Or is in a space. Maybe it's outdoors. I love I'm from Northern California, so I love an outdoor table. Right? Maybe this table is outdoors, and instead of us trying to be part of somebody else's table, right? Maybe what we should do is look around and say, you know what? That table's actually not big enough. And I'm okay with that. Y'all eat that food on that table, have a lovely time. There are plenty of resources in this space for me to build my own table, my own chairs, and make my own food. Right?
That's a very interesting concept. And I think it's actually a very good concept because we talk about the role of government that has to perhaps be shifted. And we see, unfortunately, a very noisome contentious public space, which is in fact eroding public trust. Well, we didn't have much trust in the government in the first place, right? But that said, I mean, so what is it that this future then that we have to co-create? How can you create a future if we don't have trust? So maybe that's the question I'm going to ask you. So okay, so what are some of the resources? What are some of the emotional and mental and spiritual resources that we need to consider this table building exercise?
I think one of them is to recognize that we have, and well, I'm going to say it like this. It's to recognize that as Black folks, especially in the American experience, we've been here, right? We're the only group of people that were immigrated by force. We didn't wake up one day and we're like, you know what would be awesome? Getting on a boat and floating to the other side of the world, right? But when we got here, we said, okay, this is not the future we imagined for ourselves where we were, and this is not the future we want for ourselves while we're here. So we're going to build a different thing, and that thing is going to have freedom, right? That thing is going to have, our space is going to have equity, it's going to have inclusion. But even when you go back and look at particularly the narratives of the enslaved, right, that survived, it's shocking how few of them actually make an argument for equity and inclusion that is about forcing themselves into a space, right, in sort of American culture, and are rather like, no, I just want to build my America alongside, not forced in, right? And say, hey, we're here now. And so what we're going to have now is freedom and equity, right? What we're going to have now is a table. What we're going to have now is shared governance, right? And so they really tend to talk about wanting to say, okay, we're here, we're building, we're a part of this space. And so we just want recognition, right, for that space. So what we want to think about in terms of how we think about and build the future, how I think about building the future is, again, in this idea of the future past that says, we're here and we have a right to participate in the governance of the place where we are. And so for me, it is important that we have women and men at all levels of government, right? Like, I was talking with a friend a while back about what it meant even for when you started getting Black postal workers.
Yeah.
Right? You don't really think about your postal worker, right? You're just happy that the mail came, unless it's bills, in which case, right? But in talking with and the friend that I was speaking with is actually my postal worker, right? We've become friends over the years because I've lived in the same neighborhood for a long time. And so we were talking about how important it is to have Black postal workers because these individuals facilitate communication, right? Through the delivery of mail and products, but they also facilitate communication and community building because they go to every single solitary house, right? And in a neighborhood where you may have elders, for example, right, who don't have their families near them, a postal worker, especially a Black postal worker who's coming from a collaborative community building kind of culture, is going to naturally come in and caretake for an elder, right? If you're delivering mail every day, right? The mail is delivered 6 days a week, and you start to notice that the mail is building up, you're going to come and knock on the door of that person, right?
Yes.
And see if they're all right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And make sure they're okay. And so, so we were talking about the fact that, and this actually happened because he knocked on my door several years ago because I hadn't checked my mail. I had just forgotten. Like every day I was working and I was doing a lot of things. I just kept forgetting to go to the mailbox. And so he knocked on my door and was like, "Hey, is everything okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's great." And he was like, and I'm like, "Oh my God, I forgot to check the mail." And so we started talking about how, but also, right, racism is a real thing, right? And how there was so much resistance to Black mail carriers carrying the mail outside of Black neighborhoods, right? And it's because there's this intimate understanding that the mail carrier comes to your house every day, right? Yeah. They know when you're home, they know when you're gone, right? And so
I thought about it from that perspective, but I see your point.
Right. Yeah. And so if you think about like a mail carrier as a job of the future, which most people don't, but I do, right? I think about that as a job of the future because this is someone who has a way to be able to facilitate communication in a way that keeps a community knitted together, right?
Well, assuming that they don't become automated robots, or we don't have mail altogether because we say abandon all paper, abandon all this. I don't know. This is a really good conversation to think about, but I want to stick a pin right there and take us to this issue. Because for some reason, when you said mail and bills, I started thinking about money, cash, money, and cryptocurrency. And it sort of ties into this idea of the government being articulated to some extent of what the future will look like, but then also technology as a driver. Could you step back a little bit, and before you answer this question, talk about what digital humanism is? You talked about it in your as part of your resume, and then how does that, let's say, research space inform? How might it inform, for example, how we might think about how we respond to this idea of cryptocurrency as the money of the future?
Well, digital humanities as a concept comes out of, actually, it's interesting. It starts in the 60s as humanities computing, and this idea that you can use computers to recreate human spaces of the past, right? It's really one of those sort of interesting kind of future past kind of ideas, right? That you can use computers to process and sort of crunch data in such a way that you get a larger understanding of humanity than you would if you just did the analysis and the computational analysis by hand, right, as a human. And so the way that I look at digital humanities, and particularly my area of Black digital humanities, is I look at the ways that we can use computers and computing to calculate and analyze things in sort of a big data format. And so the thing that I argue is that as Black folks, we're always going to be, and I think this is where, as Black folks, we have to always make sure we're envisioning ourselves as part of the future. When we do that, we stay linguistically ahead, right? Because we're always reinventing language in order to communicate, right? In order to share space with one another. And still, there is not a natural language processor that can do that as well as Black folks, right? But Marissa Farham, at a conference that she's a digital humanist scholar, she said something once that I actually used in an article I wrote recently, that I've been thinking about ever since, and she said, when bots learn to signify, we might be in trouble as Black folks, right? And it's something that, right? And it's something that is true, right? Like that's actually one of the ways you're talking to a Black person, right, is our ability to signify, right?
Could you explain that?
And
Because not everybody understands what the term signify means.
sure. So the idea of, I think probably the best long form discussion comes from, or one of the best, well, I was going to say two, comes from Geneva Smitherman, her book, Talking and Testifying, which at this point is a classic. And then also Henry Louis Gates' book, Signifying Monkey. And in both Smitherman's book and Gates' book, they explain this idea of signifying that happens in Black culture, where you use language to create signs, symbols, and signified moments. And so, borrowing from Austin's ideas and sort of Enlightenment, during the Enlightenment era, there's these ideas around language that you have a sign, a signified, and a signifier. And so the sign is the word, the signified is the thing that the word represents. Sign, signified, signifier, and it's the thing that the picture, the mental, the signified is the, or signifier is the mental image that you get, right? So the sign of the word.
Could you give me a quick example of that?
Yes. So if I say the word dog, right, you're going to have a mental image of what a dog is, right? Depending on your feelings about dogs, that image is either going to be good or bad. And then you're going to have a picture that you're going to pull from your mind that represents a dog, right? So the word DOG, right, is the sign. The signifier is the sort of the animal, and the signified is the picture that you get of the animal in your mind, right? I come from an idea that all culture is language and all language is culture. That you can't communicate without culture, right? You can't have culture without communication. And so the relationship between the sign, the signified, and the signifier is one that is culturally built. So for Black folks, when we signify, right, we're tapping into that same relationship between the sign, the signifier, and the signified. But what we do that is unique to sort of Black cultures throughout the diaspora is we use the emotional range that comes from the signified in order to rearrange or reascribe on the signifier, right? So I could say something like, that man a dog, right? And you know from the tone what I'm signifying, right? By describing a man as a dog, right? But I could also say it as, that man a dog. Those two statements don't mean the same thing.
Right.
I've signified different meaning in my tone. And so for Black, so we've always done this, right? From the time of enslavement, we have signified in order to speak into, right, the future present, what our relationship is to the space that we're in.
Wow. I mean, I could spend a whole time on this, but we don't have time. I want to get back to the real meat of this thing. So we're talking about the future of Black America. Signifying is important because, as you say, tone is everything. In fact, our parents used to always say, "What's your tone, Missy? What's your tone?" Right?
Right.
Quickly, no, correct, self-correct, auto-correct, right? When your parents, and then there was the tone of the look. There's a tone of the look across the room that you got that generated in your head. Oh God, I'm gonna get it now. And so you sat differently immediately. So there's all these,
like you all of a sudden sat bolt up. Right? You're just like,
yeah. I want to come back to something you said about the future. And this idea of the formerly enslaved in America, because there's a contention also arising right now, that I think it might be nice to spend a little time around, about this multicultural Black identity, right? So we have American descendants of slavery, then we have the descendants of slavery from the Americas. So Caribbean
Mhm.
people, Brazilian blacks, Colombian blacks who have moved here in search of a different kind of economic freedom, usually, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
And of course, you have newly come African immigrants by choice who experience coloniality more so than a skin-based um,
Mhm.
identity formation.
Mhm.
So my question is, as we think about in this future of Black America, one of the things that has been coming up for me as somebody who sees myself as a bridge builder between all these worlds, so I'm comfortable in all these spaces, is
Mhm.
how are we going to be able to reconcile some of the tensions? Or can we, first of all, even, should you must even try, reconcile some of these tensions between the American dream as perceived by immigrants like myself,
Mhm.
and then the American nightmare versus the American dream, which most African American descendants of slavery have in constant they're in constant position in their minds. I mean, I think most Americans who are born here and have no parents from elsewhere have a constant, like, mimetic genetic coding of terror that they live with. How
Mhm.
might how might this digital humanities process help to perhaps unearth new ways of seeing and thinking and believing and then
Mhm.
wording things
Mhm.
so that we can create a more cohesive narrative that might be
Mhm.
needed for us to construct this new table?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. One of the ways that I see this happening is through the understanding that our past is documented in multiple ways, right? I think part of what creates this sort of American nightmare for Black folks is this constant sort of denial of recorded history, right? That which comes very much out of sort of what is um, beneficial to whiteness in the American state, right? Is to say, and it's the whole argument around reparations is, you know, is always at the base of it is, well, we don't have a record, we don't have an accurate record, so we can't really give reparations because we don't know who we're giving it to, right? Lies before God. Right? The thing that we know, and that I'm really excited to see happening more in digital humanities spaces, is a digitizing of the record of enslavement, right? And what we have found in that processing is that you can find in that digitized record records from tax collectors, insurance companies, right? Just even those two basic things, right? When I talk with my students about that, they're like, well, what do you mean? And I'm like, what's the purpose of a tax collector, right? To collect taxes, to support the government. How do you base tax collection? You base it on property. Well, if you are going to tax someone, which is a thing that happened, based on property of how many enslaved people you had, you couldn't just count them. You had to name them, right? So in lots of states, giving a number wasn't enough, right?
Mm.
They wouldn't accept your number. You had to say, right? Who are they? What gender are they? How old are they? When did you acquire them? From whom? And in what condition?
Mm.
And your tax was based on those 6 answers.
Wow. I mean,
Right.
this is interesting because it's a whole another way now I see of using data differently in a way that the data can crunch it so we get to it. And it now ties into one of the things that I've been putting on the table, which I only discovered, I'm not a historian, I'm an engineer. I only discovered in doing some research on Caribbean American history from the 17th century, when they were both British colonies, looking at the relationship from George Washington went down to Barbados, which at the time was the creme de la creme of British properties
Yes.
and learned how to rub noses with the elite in Barbados, came back and then became part of the elite because he had rubbed noses. And then come to find out that one of the biggest tax evasion people, right, was a New York slave owner / shipbuilder who said, don't send me my slaves to the New York port because I'll have to pay more taxes. It was in a letter or something. Send them to New Jersey because it's cheaper. And I was like, oh my God. And this person is a founder of Columbia University. And so I said, so I'm saying there were slaves coming up from the West Indies, especially to the north. Yes, we know about the Charleston port entry, but I didn't know that there were slaves being brought to the north, as well as some freed blacks from the West Indies who came up and became the blacks that settled in Manhattan and became a problem then for the authorities. So it was a whole lot of complexity. So when we're talking about things like, I'm going to the question of reparations, because one of my concerns is I would say it's a fear. And so the people in the reparations movement who know me and who are acquainted with my Garvey side of my life can't understand why I do not wholeheartedly embrace reparations. And I say that I'm concerned because the way reparation is bandied about, right? It is as if to say money is going to fix anything. And I'm saying it's not going to fix the crux of the matter because the system and the constructs are still there. And we see clearly in the pushback against critical race theory, which should have never entered the common lexicon, if you ask me, because it is not in the common understanding of most average people to understand. Now we have books being banned. So we have, on the one hand, this outrage that every statue should be torn down, which I'm against. Let the statues stay where they are because they signify a history that we should not forget. When you put it in a museum, it is to say, well, those days are over and it's gone. And we have, who's going to actually go into a museum every day? So there is a rationale behind rethinking even our response, which is to go immediately to the extreme rage and not to the futures literate approach that says, wait a minute, what are we really trying to accomplish? Could you tell me then, if having a project of digital humanities that explores some of the signifiers, for example, namings of streets and statues and then books being banned, could help us really educate people in a more rich environment, contextual way about the dangers of polarization of one side or another.
I think that, so I'm of the opinion that tearing the statues down actually makes sense. What doesn't make sense is tearing them down and then hiding them away, right? Or tearing them down and melting them down and acting like they weren't there, right? For me, it is very much about context. So whether you take them down and put them in a museum and put context around them in order to educate people about their purpose, or you leave them where you are and you do the same work, right? The thing is about
or leave them where they are and put context right where they are.
Right. Put context right where they are.
Which is my preference.
Right. And it is for a lot of folks, right, to say, no, what we need to do is leave them where they are and put context around them, right? And talk about the fact that a lot of these statues went up in the 1950s and 1960s, right, as a response from the daughters of the American Revolution and the daughters of the Civil War, to say that they wanted this very particular, very purposefully written narrative, right, around Civil War, folks. I can't call them heroes, right? Like these Civil War icons in the South, right? And that the goal always, right, was to put these statues up as a way to remind Black folks that you might have won the battle, but you didn't win the war. Because the war was always cultural, right? the war is always about maintaining practices of space and place, right?
Know your space, know your place. And even though the law
Right.
says XYZ, we will not excise our particular virus that
Right.
says we must hate you simply because the melanin in your skin is a little bit more
Right.
cells than ours are. And that is a really
Right.
I think insightful. I really was not aware, because I'm not a student of American history,
Mhm.
that they were on a bit, but I do understand though this idea that, and this is interesting, and I think it's part of what your work hopefully will begin to uncover, is this interesting, this idea that, when people are wounded and down, like you give them a bone to suck on, right? I
Mhm.
kind of see the statues as a bone to suck on. And so I
Mhm.
kind of, that's probably why I'm for leave them right where they are, lest we forget. And then you put context around them. So you
Mhm.
just, so wherever statue is, you build another monument, you build a pole, and you write, you etch on the pole or right on the bottom of the base, you add a new base, and you say, and this is what also happened at the same
Mhm.
time.
Right. Right. And I think that that's something that there's this book recently that came out called 13 Clocks, which is a book about it's American history. And it analyzes this way that race and racism became part of how the founding fathers united 13 colonies together against an
Exactly.
enemy, right? In order, and that enemy wasn't just the British, right? That's the part of the story we want to tell now, is say, well, it was the enemy was the British. It's like, it was, but how do you get people who see themselves as British to fight against their home country as colonizers, right? And he argues that you do that actually through the post and through newspapers, right? But what happened was the British were actually starting to see, after so many years of colonial power, were actually starting to become very concerned about how they were going to continue to do enslavement. And the worry actually that was actually going to mean the end of the British Empire, right? They're starting to become a lot of concern about that. And so in order to try to hang on to the US colonies, they were already threatening to free all of the African enslaved in the 13 colonies, which was also something that for them, they were like, these folks might be more useful to us as taxable citizens, right? Rather than enslaved persons that we collect taxes on as property, right? That there's a longer term benefit to taxing you as a citizen than the single tax of once you come in the port, right? Like what you brought up of the founding father who didn't want his enslaved coming in through New York, but wanted them coming in through New Jersey. At that time, both ports are a British port, right? But the taxes were different. And but in the UK, they're starting to think about, I can get tax money once, right? Taxing the enslaved as property, or I can get tax money for a lifetime from them working and paying for goods and producing goods. Maybe we need to start thinking about this.
Yeah.
Right. But in the 13 colonies, you have people who are like, hold on, right? This is the basis of my wealth. We're not doing that, right? And so how do you start to mobilize people, right? You start to mobilize them around the idea that the government's trying to take your income away by taking away your Black people, right? But for the Black folks, they're like, well, hold on a second, right? Both the free and the enslaved, they're like, you can't sit here talking about how they're enslaving you, and that's what you're going to do, really, right here in front of me. That's what we're doing. That's the conversation you want to have. Are you sure? Right. And it's at that time where also, and this book talks about that, it's at that time also where there starts to be a lot of push also against the indigenous as well, right? Because the British are dealing with those indigenous tribes and groups as fellow nations, right? On the same, on a similar plane, right? Where they're sending, emissaries and setting up in certain cities and towns, places where the governmental representatives of those indigenous groups can come and do government to government business.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And
we often forget that about the story of that actually indigenous peoples here are actually sovereign nations. We often forget because they have been so subjugated. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so in looking at sort of, again, going back to this idea of the future present and the future past, right? Part of what I hope we're able to do with these sort of big data digital humanities projects is to unearth that documentation and that history and really start to look at how that functions, right? And really start to look at how language functions, how culture functions, how narrative functions in order to create race and racism, right? That these aren't things that just exist because, right? There is a lot of work that is put in terms of language to communicate these things in a variety of ways that keeps them sort of sustained, if you will, right? And so for me, that's what I look at in terms of these projects, is how we can use these projects to understand where we were in our past future, and where we're going with our future past and our future present, right? And how we want to envision ourselves moving forward into the future. One of the ways that I see that happening is actually around a conversation of reparations, right? One of the things that I say is that it's not actually, for a lot of people, reparations isn't about money. It's actually about recognizing that the work was put in to create a racist state, right? Acknowledge that that happened. It didn't happen on accident. It didn't happen, because it fell out of the sky. It happened because people made a decision about the way that they wanted to build their nation, and the way that they wanted to build that nation was in a way that separated Black and Indigenous people out as an enemy, right? In order to give white folks a way to create a sense of solidarity for themselves and move in a particular direction.
And move away from the serfdom and the feudal societies they had escaped, and recognizing what most people don't seem to remember, that many of the people that came to the Americas were fleeing something, and then they became the very thing that they were fleeing. And that is an interesting contrast about human condition. One or two more questions before I get to the end. I really want to bring in the idea of the private sector here. Because communication in the 21st century is not just, the three stations that we grew up with in the 60s and the 70s. It's not just the 5 major newspapers. It is everybody who has a smartphone, right? And so as we talk about then this reparations conversation as being a big, let's say, knitting factor of the Black agenda, right? Even if you don't agree with it, it is certainly a thing we all talk about, right? So it's definitely a knitting factor from that perspective. How might we then, understanding that the power of communicating narratives and ideas and stories and words that we may need to make up about the future, how are we going to then use these new opportunities, if you will, to surface this new idea of this new table that you're talking about? Because the fact of the reality is, my concern also is looking beyond our, I would say, our narrow interests, and narrow because actually we're only like 15% of the population. We're really a small minority in America, right? But our impact on the world stage is so large. It's like Jamaican thing. For a small island with only 2.5 million people, we really have a humongous impact, right? But Black culture, it's like we are almost like the driver of culture. We're almost like the driver of the moral arc of humanity. That's what I think anyway. Maybe that's hubris on my part. I'm willing to say it's ego, right? And it's almost like I feel as if to say the shallow conversations we're having around reparations is going to diminish the moral authority I feel, quite frankly, as a descendant of the formerly enslaved from Jamaica who fought so many wars and so many slave rebellions and so many things that happened in Jamaica that led to some of what happened, around the world in terms of slavery. So I guess my question is, how does someone like yourself who has influence among the creation of things, right, help us to understand better how we might need to use language and words and communication tools we do have at our disposal to deepen and widen this landscape of what a repaired future could look like? Because I don't think we are having conversations about that. What does a repaired Black America look like in 2050 against the backdrop of America no longer being a sole superpower, of there being, robots having our jobs, of there being no unions, of there being climate change, space faring, whatever? What does that look like?
I think the sort of one of the things that's coming to my mind as you're asking that question is a book called Wicked Flesh, that recently came out by Jessica Marie Johnson. She's a historian I believe she's at Johns Hopkins. And she, in that book, looks at the ways that Black women, particularly African and Caribbean women, were part of the economic, sort of going back to this idea of how private business, right, private corporations are part of the future. She looks at it in a point of enslavement, of how freeborn African and Caribbean women were part of the economic taste drivers and cultural drivers of what was considered culturally cool or culturally important, right, during that time period, right, of enslavement. And so I see that sort of using that kind of concept, right, is one way that we're always going to participate in the future, right? That we're always going to be a group of people who, through our cultural drive and our cultural taste, are going to create not just the cultures of the future, but also the businesses of the future as well. And so for us, it's really about ownership, right? It's really about, when we're sort of going back to my idea of building the table for me is about owning the table, right? So that if I don't want to anymore over here, I can pick up my table and leave, right? But if I don't own the table, I don't get to choose where the table is, right? If I don't own the chairs, I don't get to choose where the chairs are, right? And so that for me is the thing that I see as centrally important for the way that Black folks in the United States, throughout the Americas, throughout the Caribbean, and really, throughout the world, right? The way that the diaspora functions is about ownership at this point, right? So much of how the US empire has been built, especially in the last 100 years, has been about exporting culture rather than tangible product. And so what do I mean by that? I mean sports, I mean education, I mean music, I mean film, right? Television, radio, mediated constructs,
We
right?
all
Even
drank the
to some,
Kool-Aid.
right?
And we all have been forced to drink the Kool-Aid. Trust me on that one.
Right, exactly. And so, and to some degree, right, especially for Black folks, it's like we mixed up the Kool-Aid for ourselves. We didn't mix it up for everybody else. We were trying to share, right? But it was we were forced in some ways, right, in order to do that. And I think that what we can look at from as a move into the future is to understand something about the past, right? The musician, formerly known as Prince, who passed away, at the end of his life, really became very active in this idea of music ownership, right? And became part of a group of musicians who were trying to get back the ownership rights of their own masters, as well as the masters of other Black artists. And we see this in hip hop happening as well, right? Where you have artists who are actively trying to get their masters back, right? Now, why is this instructive and important for looking at the future?
Yeah.
It's actually the way that you control culture, right?
Yeah.
If you can own the master, then you get to decide not just how and when it's used, but by whom and how much money are you going to make from that process?
Yeah.
Right. And so if you have to participate in American imperialist culture, right, participate as an owner.
Yeah.
Right.
Let me ask
especially
you
if you create something.
Yeah. And this leads into the last question I want to ask, which is the headline then that you're seeing. If you want to participate in American imperialist culture, like how you phrase that, if you're going to do that, then you should at least become an owner, not just the owned upon, right? So we're not saying we necessarily agree with American imperialist culture, but we're saying if we have to participate in it, we should not always be the one that is owned. So having said that, I want you to jump into 2030 and tell me your preferred success headline that you see, that you would like to see, that Dr. Tanisha Taylor has hopefully had a hand in creating over the next 8 years of the work that you're doing. 2030, what's your preferred headline?
My preferred headline is Black women own it all. Right?
Wow.
Right. That we own our cultural product, right? And we're getting paid for that cultural product. And that means that, I recently saw a tweet of somebody explaining a thing in academia that people don't understand about academia, right? And one of the things that people don't understand about academia, right, when we publish articles in journals, people think that when the journal charges you $80 for that one article, that the scholar who wrote it gets any kind of money, right? But the thing that we all know in academia is we don't see a single penny of that. Right?
Exactly.
That's
just to get accepted as somebody who knows that they know.
Right. Less than 1% of the world's population has an earned PhD, right? Of that 1%, less than 10% are Black, right? And because of that, we all tend to kind of know each other, right? But what happens throughout academia, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, is that this part of publishing, right, where we publish but we don't profit, is something I actually hope does change. But it's also something where I see that is part of this idea of Black women own everything, right? That we start to own our intellectual property in particular kinds of ways, right? Now, as scholars, we all maintain the ownership rights of the intellectual property. But like, for example, if I want to go back and republish my article, World Making, World Breaking, as part of an anthology that I've written of other things, I have to get permissions from the publisher in order to do that, and may actually end up, even though I would get royalties from the book, I might have to pay them for use of the article, right? And this is common, right? This is why a lot of scholars do not create anthologies of their own work, right? Because, you don't want to end up having to pay, right? And if they do create anthologies of their own work, they tend to create anthologies of their own work published by the same publisher who published the journal articles, right? So if your journal articles were published by Taylor and Francis or Routledge or Sage, journals that are published by those big publishing houses, academic publishing houses, you tend to keep everything together, which is a profit motive for the publisher, but diminishes the profit motive for the individual scholar. So that's an example of, for me, Black women owning everything, right? Is to say that we're participating in these environments. And so for me, it's about owning the knowledge of how this functions, right? Because we have so many more Black folks coming into these spaces. That's what I see. I want Black women to own everything, and that means owning understanding of how these things function, because you're participating. So participate with knowledge, girl. Don't participate ignorant.
This is as good a place as any to come to an end. I could talk to you for hours. But I really want to say thank you. Your headline is certainly very optimistic. Black women own it all, and a very good explanation of what you mean. And I really liked it. So we have to continue this outside of this little table here. Yes. But thank you so much, Dr. Tanisha Taylor, for participating in this year, this conversation on the future history of Black America, Department Chair and Associate Professor of Communications in the School of Communication at Texas Southern University. Folks, that is it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us on the Futures Forum Live. Share the future. Remember that we here explore salient ideas to create sustainable futures, and that the future is embedded in our landscape of today. So go out and seize the future. And as we say in Jamaica, until next time, and safe journeys.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Future Sense Now with Dr. Claire Nelson. Future Sense Now is produced by the Futures Forum in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Remember, our futures are embedded in the landscape of our present stories. Seize the day, share this story, and share the future.